Wow, gosh, thank you, Mia, for that really brave and wonderful presentation, and to Sofa and the rest of the team that organised this conference for having me here today. I'm very, very moved by that presentation, not only because I lost a journalist friend in Syria recently, but the title of this talk for me is Organising for Freedom. And the situation in Syria is particularly pertinent in thinking about how international relations or global imperialism is one bar to organising for freedom. But given that we've just had a very emotive talk on Syria, I wondered whether we could just have a moment where you maybe talk to the person next to you on what freedom means for you personally, and if you're not sitting next to someone, whether you might be able to shuffle closer to somebody, whether behind you or in front of you, if you can turn your neck around to do that, to have that brief conversation. So Syria is one example of how global imperialism impacts upon relations in addition to an authoritarian state, the way in which an authoritarian state can impact upon the autonomy of individuals to decide what they want to do. That's, for me, one very clear example of a bar to freedom. But I wondered if we could just take a moment to think about other definitions of freedom, your definitions of freedom. Maybe it's not that, maybe that's not part of your definition of freedom, maybe it's something completely different. So if you'll all entertain me to take a moment to do that, please shuffle around and find someone to have a very brief conversation, a couple of minutes. Thanks. That was a very cruel question, such a big question, but for me, an incredibly important one. If I'm thinking about making interventions, if I'm thinking about who am I, how I am formed, what my hopes are for the future, what type of world do I want to be a part of, do I struggle for, do I hope for, do I imagine? My definition of freedom defines what types of interventions I will choose to make. And I think that without thinking about that starting point, we can end up in situations where we are maybe trying to make interventions without being cognizant of the way in which bars to realizing autonomy or realizing freedom can actually be defining our interventions. So that was the purpose of starting with that very big and cruel question. Thank you for entertaining me with it, and thanks to Rob for being my partner and for giving me the opportunity to hear his definition. I'm going to try and quote you because I thought it was very poetic. But one of the things that you said as we were talking was about the idea of an individual being, I think, an individual thumbprint, and that being entered on a piece of clay, but that piece of clay, I might want to call it social relationships that are defined by social institutions, might impact how that thumbprint can be made on that piece of clay. So for me, when I'm thinking about having the opportunity to realize myself, to realize who I am, what are the parameters that are allowed in relation to that? And I think for some people, it's capitalism. For some people, it's imperialism. For some people, it's their gender and the opportunities that may or may not allow them. It may be their sexuality, their race, their age, their ability or disability. It may be a lot of things. And I think one of the crucial problems that we've had in thinking about organizing for a better world is maybe limiting our understanding of a free society to a society free of capitalism, which is a huge scourge, but I don't believe the only one. And I think being cognizant of the way in which power, state power, power exercised in social relationships in different ways, gender, sexuality, age, ability, etc., can impact upon our ability to exercise freedom. And I guess for me, by having an understanding of what limits freedom, I can begin to think about a society that is different, that doesn't have the mechanisms of capitalism that limit my freedom, that doesn't have the mechanisms of state power that limit my freedom, that doesn't have the forms of social relationships that we're born into that define what we might perceive of as beauty or as the appropriate form to express love or affection, or in what type of relationship, or doesn't impact the way in which somebody might experience state power as a result of their race, for example, and their opportunities later in life. And by having a theory of society, I guess is what I'm saying, we can start to think about a vision for a future. And that vision for a future can inform our strategy today. And for me, without doing that initial exercise, our strategy today may be limited in some respects. Later on, I'm going to, if I have enough time, I'm going to play a video of two people who are members of the Organization for a Free Society in the US. And I probably won't have time, so maybe I'll just give the example now. But one of them is a organizer with the Restaurant Opportunities Center in New York, and the Organization for a Free Society has 3 chapters in the US, in New York, Albany, and Detroit, and a membership of between 60 to 100 people. But he was describing how his work as an organizer in the restaurant industry in New York City would not be as meaningful if he didn't have an intersectional understanding of the race aspects of the way in which the empowering and disempowering work is structured within a New York restaurant, and how different types of work are given to European, American, US citizens of European descent in comparison to those from other parts of the world who are given far less empowering tasks, and that to do something as simple as try and get unity within a workplace on advocating for a $15 per hour wage would be hindered if he didn't have that holistic understanding of how different backgrounds impact upon where people are coming from when they go into a workplace. So that's a kind of workplace example of how a holistic understanding of oppressions can impact upon the interventions or the work that we seek to do. I think on that, I might try and just play this video, and Sophie, I need your passport. And maybe leave it at that, and kind of leave it open to have a lot more questions in the discussion.
Paul-Spannos as an organization, of course, wouldn't exist if it didn't have an underlying political theory. We're not a grassroots organization or institution. Paul-Spannos is a participatory socialist organization that seeks to unite revolutionaries across grassroots social movements. By participatory socialism, we mean a multi-dimensional social revolution in the spheres of kinship, economy, polity, community, culture, and ecology, in ways that foster and strengthen solidarity and self-management, diversity, and other values in that tradition.
It's not enough just to attack the system for what the ills of it, but be able to provide hope for an alternative. And that a lot of people, on some level, know some of the problems, but they need to be inspired and rallied toward the fighting movement and fighting organizations that have a vision of that new society.
Failure to sufficiently address issues of LGBTQ, women's power, workers' power, and national liberation, amongst other issues, has been a historical problem for the left in the United States, but also in many countries globally. I think that you can identify those trends historically and see that Economic reductionism has been one of the major problems, as well as liberal reformism and opportunism, and that these have plagued our movements for more than 100 years now. In terms of OFS's composition, we strive to build a working class, multiracial, multinational organization led by women, LGBT, queer people, overwhelmingly working class, and overwhelmingly people of color, which in the United States means Black or New African, Chicano, Latino, Indigenous, Asian, and as well as organizing the revolutionary sectors of the Euro-American working class.
And if I might just add to that too, we kind of, one of the main tenets too is putting forth a positive vision of for socialism. It's not just a no, we're against, we're for. And that's some stuff Pat was just talking about. It's not just theory. We actually don't reflect most of the organization as far as forward.
Yeah, despite the appearance of two white Irish American restaurant workers here, OFS does have
it's a multinational
a selective membership process. So a grassroots organization or institution is any grouping that unites the oppressed to defend their sectional or intersectional or multi-sectional interests against the imperialist system, work for the general improvement of their living conditions, and to provide services that are not provided by this system. Versus a revolutionary organization which is united around ideology as a starting point, as opposed to defense, resistance, and service providing. Eventually, I think we envision a convergence between the two. That's what we advocate and work towards. But given the position that we're in the United States, and I think for much of the left globally, we're not even on the level of a strategic defensive. We are approaching that point, and we're really in a period of gathering our forces again after decades of our movements being decimated and attacked by the imperialist state. And so, in terms of how we envision the unity of political theory with political practice, for our organization's perspective, we start from a theoretical position, which is that in order for movements to advance beyond a stage of simply defending past gains that are quickly being eroded, to advance past simply providing some basic services that the system doesn't provide for the oppressed, to move in the direction of taking power and of people having control over the decisions that affect their lives. A fusion needs to occur between revolutionary ideology and day-to-day practice, which is revolutionized through that unity. That unity is only formed not by simply writing books or articles or essays or conducting interviews or making films or art. All of those things have a central role to play in movement building. But I think we fundamentally believe that revolutionaries who share a common ideology need to embed themselves within grassroots social movements and have to be at that point of defense or resistance or service providing in order to build organic connections with the multitude of oppressed people, which again means the working class, women, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer people, people of color, and neo-colonial nations, and that's fundamentally the task of revolutionaries.
Without
that was 5 minutes of about an hour-long interview with Pat and John, who are both members of the Organization for a Free Society. And I think one context which wasn't necessarily obvious because it was kind of started without their introductions is that OFS is an organization of organizers. So to be a part of it, you have to be involved in service provision or defending a service or a campaign for something. The idea being that without that, even though you might have all the best intentions and ideas, for a future society, you're not learning from the ground and not putting those lessons back into the theory and constantly revising your theory to move it and develop it over periods of time going forward. So although there is this loose theory of understanding capitalism, understanding imperialism, understanding how state power works, how culture operates to form gender binaries or racism or nationalism, there might be modes of thinking about limits on freedom that we haven't thought of yet, that come through practice, that come through getting involved in organizing, getting involved in a campaign, getting involved in fighting for something. And there are very real things that preclude people from doing that. So one of the other things that OFS strive to do is look at internally reflecting the future that they want. So a lot of their members spend time in the initial part of getting into the organization, thinking about how they have internalized forms of oppression. So they're creating a safe space for people to come and participate fully, as much as they're able to under the world that we live in, but being cognizant of how being born into this world impacts us, impacts the way that we perceive things, and how thinking about prefiguring new types of social relationships, new types of organizing, new types of building connections with each other, making sure that the internal process of the organization is democratic and people have a decision-making say to the extent that they're going to be affected by the outcome of a decision, are all very, very important, because otherwise we're just repeating what we're saying that we're against within the internal structure of our own organizations. So that's all I think I'm going to say, and hopefully I'm relatively on time. Thanks. Thank you.